conference is being recorded. At this time, I would like to turn the webinar over to Rochelle Seeger. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Rochelle. I'm here at the Foundation for a Healthy Kentucky. So glad you joined us today. I work here at the Foundation as a Community Health Research Officer. So a lot of the work I do involves data, so I'm thrilled to have this great presenter with us today. First, I want to tell you a bit about the Foundation's mission and also some upcoming events that we have on the calendar. The Foundation for Healthy Kentucky's mission is to address the unmet health needs of Kentuckians, and we were founded in 2001. This photo you see is a picture from Pine Mountain in Whitesburg, Kentucky. We were just down there at a workshop with the Kane Community Kitchen, and we got an opportunity to see the beautiful view in Letcher County. The Foundation's mission to address the unmet health needs of Kentuckians is completed by developing and influencing policy, improving access to care, reducing health risks and disparities, and promoting health equity. Information about the Foundation can be found at our website, healthy-ky.org, and there you can find a lot of our reports, including the recent videos and final report from our Investing in Kentucky's Future initiative, which was addressing children's health in our state. I also work on the Kentucky Health Issues poll for the Foundation and the data website, kentuckyhealthfacts.org. You can find all the information on our website, healthy-ky.org. And why we're here today is the Health for a Change training series. The Foundation launched this series in 2011, and we've had nearly 3,000 unique participants from every Kentucky county. That's really exciting. I plan and coordinate these events for the Foundation, and you can find an upcoming schedule of events, archives of past events, also on our website. Just check out the events page, Health for a Change. I just want to go through a few of our upcoming events. In the Health for a Change training series, next week we'll be in Scottsville, Kentucky, near Bowling Green, just outside of Bowling Green, at a farm, Need More Acres Farm. We'll be having a coalition building workshop. That is going to be a really exciting event with a wide variety of folks who are working in the food and food access in the Bowling Green area. So please feel free to join us. August 1, we'll have another webinar on the 2020 U.S. Census and checking in with Kentucky colleges and universities and how they can get involved for a complete count for the 2020 Census in Kentucky. And the final announcement today, I know many of you on our webinar here today will also be joining us in person at the Louisville office of the Foundation for Part 2 of Jessica's work, Infographics for Social Change, a Graphic Ally Hackathon. So we're thrilled you're here with us today to get some of the key concepts down in preparation for our August 2nd workshop. A couple more events we have. In Owensboro, we'll be there August 14th for our Regional Health Forum, so please mark your calendars and join us if you're in the Owensboro area, and we thank Green River Area Development District for hosting us. Next up, September 10th, the Foundation and other partners are having a School Health Coalition meeting to be held in Lexington at the Embassy Suites. I know you guys are marking your calendars for all of these things. Next up, in September 23rd, on Monday, also in Lexington at the Marriott Griffin Gate, we'll have our annual Howard L. Bose Memorial Health Policy Forum. The topic this year is medical marijuana, fact and fiction. The registration is open for that, so please check out the registration link on the Foundation's website. Last up for the announcements. In November, November 15th, we'll be in Northern Kentucky with our data forum. I imagine there's some data lovers on the phone. Even if you're not a data lover, please mark your calendar. Friday, November 15th, we'll be in Erlanger for this event that's co-sponsored with Interact for Health. I'm pleased to make all these announcements. We have a lot of exciting things coming, and we're glad you joined us today because I've been asking a lot of people, I'm interested in data visualization and infographics. Who can I talk to? And then I would see a person from Chicago, or a person who's presenting from Washington, D.C., or a person in Miami. And then 2 days, one day after the other, 2 people recommended Jessica Bellamy. And I am honored and thrilled that she's here to share some of her work with us today. And Jessica, welcome to our webinar.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with everyone. Okay. beginning of my presentation. Okay, great. So just so you know, everyone who's just so wonderful and has joined us on this video, this webinar, every now and then I might ask a question, so you'll see me open up this chat box so I can see responses from folks. So that's just all that is. Just every now and then I'm going to do that. But anyways, so hello, I'm Jessica Bellamy. I'm an information designer. I have entered this really interesting space in my career where I am constantly talking about what data equity means and data visualization, not only across the United States but also in Canada and Germany. But my experiences as far as being exposed to new voices and new opportunities to talk with colleagues was mainly because of my experience as an Adobe Creative Resident, where I was one of 6 people chosen in the world by Adobe to pursue a passion project for the course of a year. I'm also the owner of an agency called GRIDS, the Grassroots Information Design Studio. It is an organization that works with nonprofits and community groups to create information graphics. I've had this design agency for it's almost been 6 years now, so congratulations on that one. But to kind of enter into this world about data equity and the way that I perform grassroots information design, I kind of have to talk about some of the hats that I wear in my life. So just to give you some personal context. A lot of us wear a number of hats, and one of the hats that I wear is, of course, that of a designer. I graduated summa cum laude with degrees in graphic design, drawing, and Pan-African Studies, and a minor in communication from the University of Louisville. And so having that focus in some of the visual arts with 2 BFAs, I knew that I was going to go, obviously, into a visual career of sorts. I also wear the hat of a scholar. Since my summa cum laude thesis on ways to increase cultural competence through visual between the institution of art and the fundamentals of design methods, ever since that scholarly piece, I've continued to be a contributor to different publications such as the Communication Arts Magazine, and of course I really love to blog and be a part of conversations electronically with different colleagues around the country and around, well, the world at this point. I also wear the hat of a researcher. I worked in the Neurodevelopmental Science Lab at U of L for about 5 years, first as an undergraduate researcher, but then as a research analyst. In that position, in that role, I worked with participants not only gathering data, but I did a lot of observation reports, testing, working with grad students on their dissertations. So I'm joint author on a couple of different publications involving neuroscience out in the world somewhere, which I can talk more if people have questions about later. But that hat right there. And I have the hat of the communication organizer, a community organizer. And what I mean by that is I have had the privilege to be a part of organizations like Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, the Network Center for Community Change, different community groups and organizations across our city, a lot of local initiatives where from the ground up I worked with community leaders talking about ways that we can push initiatives using visual communication and aspire to our goals and milestones as a collective. I've done a lot of work in that space. So when you combine all of those hats together, you get what GRIDS really is, which is a lot more than just a design agency. And so I like to give that context when I move into conversations about data equity. And of course, I love to highlight some of the pieces that I've done because not everybody is familiar with information design. So when I talk about information design, the types of works that I create are things like posters that explain in detail. I do reports. Here's another example of a report. I do materials for community organizing, so anything that's like a one-page explainer or anything that can be easily put in someone's hand that translates complex information. I do presentation materials. I've even done medical illustrations. And of course, as of the last 2 years, I've gotten into more motion infographic design and some more interactive elements as far as what I can contribute to the information design space. These are just a couple examples. You can definitely go on either the GRID's website or my speaker website to look more, or just look on social media. I have a lot of that content there. I also am a tool designer. This is the infographic wheel, which helps designers, well, it helps anyone really, any individual choose an infographic layout based on the characteristics of their data. I'll talk more about this piece later on in the presentation, but I also consider myself to be an experienced designer, and that's because my process is rooted in a rich communication strategy, which I'll talk more about, that comes from really being ingrained with folks and making sure that the people most impacted are helped to lead the ideation, the planning, and the end work. I am very concerned with the macro context of what we design because we can be as human-centered or user-centered in our principles as we'd like, but we have to realize that whatever we create as researchers, as designers, whatever hat you're wearing, whatever you put into the world is either complicit or in opposition to some of the accepted stereotypes and dehumanizing stigmas and other institutionalized genres of oppression that are out there. And so always putting that lens on my work is another way that I continue to push, and I'll talk about some of those mechanisms of accountability to help me stay true to making better and stronger work. So we're in an interesting time for data storytelling. Not only is there a diversity of ways in which to do so, but we also have some interesting barriers and impediments. Right now we kind of have a little bit of a war on information. I think I first saw this hashtag back in early 2017, where a lot of our databases involving environmental data, involving housing disparities, but specifically the housing disparities databases that were federally funded were starting to disappear and be defunded, and different legislation was being created that would make sure that these sort of databases would not even exist anymore on any platform. So, of course, you had this huge movement from different scientists, researchers, data analysts from across the nation, and even in a few other adjacent nations, even from Canada, that were really concerned about the way that science was being silenced. You saw legislation that advised organizations like the CDC that if they wanted to continue getting funding from the federal level to avoid certain words. What were those words? Well, if you're curious, there were words like diversity, avoid words like vulnerable, transgender, fetus, evidence-based, science-based, and entitlement. These sort of things have been happening for the last 2-3 years. And so we're in a really interesting time for data storytelling, and I'm really curious what the future can look like. All of us on this a part of this conversation right now are a part of what that future is going to look like. So the way I see it is that between the misrepresentation that are caused by these changes and the underrepresentation through some of the ways that we're choosing to visualize our data, we're actually exacerbating some pain points. We're exacerbating pain points around stereotypes, proliferating systemic issues that work against disenfranchised and vulnerable populations, and a lot of times we're unintentionally objectifying and exploiting impacted populations. And so I like to start from a place where let's look at us all as purpose-driven, whether we're designers or researchers. If you consider yourself to be an information designer or an experienced designer, I'm hoping that we can examine our aspirations through some of the nodes of this presentation, not to make those aspirations better, not to make them quote-unquote good, but to make them braver. I'm hoping that some of the things that I touch on today will help you move through some of the difficulties and challenges that you face in transforming your work, help you move through those discomforts to get to those more robust communication strategies and more inventive ways of visualizing that does little to no harm, hopefully no harm. There should be no expectation of harm ever in doing this work. So yeah, just to kind of set it up that way. So I'm going to use the term equity a lot, so I definitely need to give you a definition so that you know what I'm talking about when I use this term. So I imagine a lot of folks have probably seen this model. How many people have seen this model of equity? I'll kind of move this over so you can see it. So I'm looking in the chat bar. If you've seen it before, you can say, I've seen it, I've seen it. This is kind of a test to see if this works. Yes, liver, yes. Great. So, right, cool. I'm going to close that. So this is the illustration that's commonly used to talk about equity. So we're going to talk about revising this model. Ever since a year or two ago, let me minimize this. I read this wonderful piece on Medium by this person who has the pen name Sippin' the Inequity, which I think is an excellent pen name, that talked about that initial illustration actually being problematic. And since then, when I first saw this article, I shared it with a bunch of people. It actually kind of caused a little shake-up in a couple of comment sections and things like that. So I realized that this literature was not enough, and so I decided to create some visuals to better explain what Sippin' the Inequity was trying to get at. So, of course, when we look at this model, we think, oh, well, what's wrong with it? It accurately depicts the difference between equality and equity. It's a story about these three kids who love baseball, seeing this baseball game as their common goal that they aspire to do. They have a systemic impediment, which is this fence. So they decide, well, let's get a resource. If we all get the same resource in an equal world, then not all of our needs are going to be met against that said systemic barrier, right? So as you can see with the taller kid, they can see way over the fence, the medium-sized child, they can see over, and then the smaller child who's unable to see across the fence. And of course, when you look at the idea of equity, then the distribution of that resource would be allocated based on need, where the first kid who's really tall doesn't need a box, you can still see the game. Second kid needs one, third kid needs two. So the problem with this illustration is that by making the children three different sizes, we're actually making the problem not just a systemic barrier, but we're making certain people the problem themselves. We're saying that this child is inherently needy. This child is lacking in some way. This child has flaws that prevent them from reaching the aspirations that they have. And when we start to internalize that content, we start to create stereotypes and stigma around people that aren't able to achieve right off the bat when systemic barriers are in play. That's what Sippin' the Inequity was trying to get at. So what does this new model of equity look like? That's the question. So the way I reimagined it is if you imagine some other kids, if we look at them at equal height, right, the way that we kind of embody that idea of equal height is by going by a principle I learned pretty early on in organizing, which comes from the Network Center for Community Change, and that's that everyone is creative, resourceful, and whole. Right now you should be saying to yourself, I am creative, resourceful, and whole, because it is true. Even when we do not always automatically see it, having that assumption, that initial starting point will actually make your work more whole, and you'll have a more holistic and healthy view of the people that you're interacting with, the people that are your accomplices in succeeding in the initiatives that you're working on. We should all start from this standpoint because our contributions are worthy, and so that's what this mantra is all about. So when we reimagine the children same height with the same type of passion, they really want to see the baseball game, the same systemic impediment of the fence, then when we visualize what it looks like, what's actually happening with these two individuals, we have to keep the problem with the system. So right here we have a changing in ground level where some people might be on higher points which allow them the access of viewing the games, and others at lower points which do not allow them the access of viewing the games. And so when you focus on that and keep the problems with that systemic gap, the systemic disparity, then this is what equity looks like. We're actually creating fixes for problems that are not inherent to the individuals, and we stop stigmatizing the individuals who need those types of supplements to get through those gaps in our systemic disparities. Does that make sense? I'm going to, how do I bring it back? Oops. That's fine. I'll keep going. So essentially what equity is from this lens is it's all about creating an opportunity for all to reach their full potential. And remember that all is where everyone is creative, resourceful, and whole. That's from NC3 again. So when we're creating an opportunity for all to reach their full potential, we're doing a few things. We are making sure that we're being considerate, which means we're analyzing and evaluating our work recursively. We're making sure that we're being cooperative, but we're seeing all the people around us as subject matter experts, whether or not they're subject matter experts within a professional field or of their own experiences, and they're lending those wisdom to the work. We're making sure that we're being inclusive. Almost every time when you ask who's missing from the table, there's somebody missing from the table. So making sure that more people are incorporated in that decision making from ideation all the way through to implementation. Making sure that we're being accountable, which means being willing to take responsibility for how the work that we make affects the world, whether it's negative or positive. Again, that macro lens. And it's about being flexible, being willing to start over. We can't always have the foresight to know how the work that we make is going to affect others or affect a problem, but we can have the agility and the humility and the integrity rather as well to revisit those solutions and find better and stronger, more effective solutions. That's how you build really robust campaigns. I always like to also add that from the perspective of this wonderful scholar from NYU Wagner, Natasha Iskander, one thing that she writes about is that we as individuals, we cannot escape our own personal bias, blind spots, or political pressures. So working as an individual is actually moot for trying to do anything for public good. You should be working collaboratively. So some things I'm going to talk about. Of course, I'm going to talk about some basics about infographics. I'm going to move into talking about research tips, which I'm going to skim really because I feel like based on the information that you gave in the initial surveys, a lot of folks look like they already have a grasp on that. You're going to be able to have access to a PDF of this PowerPoint, which has a lot of context. But I'm going to graze over some things that I think that I've identified as not as necessary to dive deep into. But you'll still have that through the PDF. So we're going to touch on research, jump into some planning, talking about communication strategy building, and some of my grounding principles for my accountability. And then we're going to jump into design. We're going to talk about some visual thinking and composition strategies. And of course, if we have time, we'll get to some general Q&A. So let's start here. Primary step 4, creating an infographic. So there are 3 phases in creating an infographic. The first phase is the research phase, okay? The second, planning, and the third, design. In the research phase, it's pretty traditional where you have your hypothesis, you're analyzing it, low and high fidelity terms, you're cross-referencing all those things, data collection. Some of you might be familiar with the CRAP analysis methodology if you're doing your secondary research. Technically it has 2 A's. I like to always say that if you're looking it up. But CRAP analogy is just where CRAP analysis looks at the currency, the reliability, authority, accuracy, purpose of an article or any other type of content to help you analyze whether or not it's a valuable and good source to use in your work. That's more of a surface sort of analysis for choosing where to get your data. But I always recommend folks do deep dives into the studies that they're looking at. When you're examining the study, there are a couple of different references that you can look at. I really appreciate this piece by Zora Zupan called How to Critically Evaluate the Quality of a Research Article. And I appreciate this now book, because originally it was an article that was published in the American Psychology Association, and now it's in its second edition of printing, and it's called Critical Thinking About Research, Psychology, and Related Fields. Even if the work you're doing is not specifically related to psychology, there are so many great recommendations that help you dive into different aspects of a research study. It helps you dive into the research question, the sample, analysis of controls, the confounding variables, the research design itself, the criteria and criteria measures, data analysis, discussion and conclusion, and different ways to kind of look at the ethics that are embedded into those research studies. So I recommend that article and that book if you're trying to do some deep dives. So what I focus on is infographics when I'm creating pieces. And what infographics are ways to tell visual stories. It's just visual storytelling. Usually they're subjective, they're direct, they tend to be narrative-led. They're cousins to data visualization. Like I feel that data visualization and information graphics are pretty closely related. They're, I like to say, kissing cousins because they're similar in the fact that they are relaying facts, data points visually. But usually with data viz, you're dealing with massive data sets, and so oftentimes you see data visuals that are created with algorithms using computers and technology. And oftentimes people find these sorts of visualizations to be objective, but from the different voices that you hear now that are in the scholarship of studying and analyzing some of these data resources and thinking hard about some of these conceptions around data, we're actually finding that a lot of these databases are not as objective as they seem. So you have different conferences like Data for Black Lives that happen at MIT. I think it's in its third or fourth year. These movements are led by people like Yeshmavette Milner. Milner is constantly in Washington, D.C., talking with legislative staff about the databases that are used to prescribe risk and worthiness and how they affect us, because a lot of these databases that we don't see, data that's collected anytime we interact on the Internet, affects our ability to be employed, our ability to get housing, our ability to even be sentenced in a way where the bail and the time allotted to your time in prison is actually aligned with your crime. Like it's really surprising how much data is used for a lot of different things. And so there's also a movement to abolish big data, which is not necessarily my true belief. I love the conversations in this space because the points that they're making, a lot of them are very accurate and illuminating about data. Here's something that Milner has said: the use of big data to determine risk and worthiness was being used to extend the shelf life of racist public policies, agendas of the past, and in many cases creating new forms of racism under the guidance of objectivity and neutrality. Some other voices in this space, you have Martin Tisney, who is a regular contributor to the MIT Review. He talks a lot about data rights, which is a whole new pioneering frontier that says that us giving consent to take our data is not enough. We need to actually build this into legislation. He's very famous for saying that data is not a neutral expression of reality. There's lots of pieces out there that you can reference about him. There's also a movement around data feminism. So you can look up people like Catherine and Lauren here. Catherine I actually had the pleasure of meeting and speaking with in Germany when I was at presenting at a conference called Information Plus in Potsdam, right next to Berlin, last year. And their work talking about how people reflect on qualitative data and quantitative data differently from a data feminist lens is interesting, and how they talk about techno-chauvinism. These are things that you can definitely go research on your own or ask me more questions about, but I always like to plug it for people that are really interested in data and data analysis. So moving forward, the next phase of creating infographics is the planning phase. This is where you create your communication strategy. This is where you start to outline how you're going to use data and start to formalize that organization. So when you're in this phase, it's all about defining relationships. You're trying to dissect and analyze, discover connections, whether or not those are cause and effect or any other type of dependence or interdependent, codependent sort of relationships, looking at outliers, defining conclusions, and potentially realistic solutions and recommendations. It's a very interesting and in-depth time. You're probably right now definitely getting the impression of how long it takes me before I actually get to open my design software on my computer. It definitely takes a while. There's a lot that goes into information graphics when you're trying to build data equity into this work. So number one, I want to say you need impacted people when you're in your planning phase. You need them in ideation as well, but if for whatever reason you didn't have an ideation, you absolutely need to have them for this planning phase. And why is that? It's because you can actually never understand a problem that's related to a social injustice or a systemic gap if you are not the receiver of that systemic disparity. You can never understand the problem. But what we can do as analysts, as designers, is understand the problem as a system. Does that make sense? Understand the problem as a system. And what I mean by that is when we start to work with people that are affected by that problem, we start to see the realistic solutions, the root causes. We start to unveil some of our own blind spots and biases that Natasha Iskander referenced earlier. All of those sort of things. And you have people that are experienced designers like Greg Flory saying we should relax into the fact that we can never fully understand the problem within these types of situations, because that allows us to really utilize and leverage our expertise without feeling like we have to do everything. Focus on your expertise and allow other subject matter experts to be a part of the work to enrich it. So back to defining relationships. When we're doing this work, whether or not it looks like, spreadsheet upon spreadsheet of all this information, or if you start to use like different visualization tactics to start to help you identify different problems or different components of the system of the problem, looking at the who's, the communities that are most involved or influenced, the what, the objects, or connecting themes that are present, the where, the environments where all this is taking place, or if there's any specific or significant spatial factors are involved, the whens, the whys, and the hows. There's lots of different ways to visualize some of the ways we start thinking through processes. I tend to use this fishbone, this cause and effect diagram oftentimes to help illustrate and to also build a shared language with whomever I'm partnering with. Sometimes I even start to doodle and make little puppets. This is another way to kind of break outside of your traditional computer box, to start thinking about how things are interrelated and how other people also see these different components functioning together. So let's jump into some strategy and dissemination. So when it comes to creating a communication strategy, you really have three main components. The first one is your call to action. The second one is your target audience. The third is your actual media vehicle. What are you creating that you're putting out there to help make whatever change that you foresee? So let's talk about target audience. Your target audience should always be defined. Whenever I'm speaking to other people that are designers, analysts, anyone who's trying to create some type of communication strategy, I always say make sure that you're being targeted in your selection, because that's when you get richer work, when you realize what are the motivating factors for that individual and start to look at how they see the world. That's how you learn their language, so that you know how to speak to them. When you say that your audience is everybody, then you actually start to make more reductive and simplified work. And when you reduce it, you're not going to have as much impact, not as much buy-in, not as much engagement with that piece that you're creating. So identify who that target audience is. And it's okay if you have more than one, then that means that you'll need to make pieces for those individual target audiences. So when you're learning about that target audience, of course you're identifying who they are, what motivates them, what are their barriers to participation, to do whatever you would like them to do or to engage with this media product. Why would they choose to buy into this work? How would they access this piece of media, this product that you're designing, and start to think of whether or not are these the people that are most affected by the problem? Are they connected in any way? What is their relationship? Just to start to think about profiling them so that you can learn how to speak to them. Once you figure out who your target audience is, you started to create this analysis, let's dive in more into what motivates the specific target audience to action. So I have 5 basic motivators that I love to share with folks, and they are, number 1, narrative. Sometimes an emotional appeal or narrative speaks really loud to an individual or target audience. Sometimes an economic argument, talking about how money is affected. Sometimes an authority figure, having some type of quote from someone who resonates with that target audience, whether it's a mayor or if it's someone who's a community leader of some sort. Having someone who is really important that already has buy-in or support in that initiative might speak really loudly to that target audience. Whether or not there's an immediate need. When I say immediate need, I mean, is there a short deadline? Is there a lot of potential for a huge impact, or is it a hot button topic right now? Sometimes that speaks really loudly to folks. And sometimes it's popularity and consensus. How many people are already involved? How many people are already engaged? How many people already have buy-in or support whatever initiative you might be designing your research to promote or your infographic to promote? This is really important to start thinking about in your communication strategy building phase. So now let's start talking about what specific data will motivate. We already have an idea of what moves these folks to action, but what specific data points should we be looking for? So there is a big difference between qualitative versus quantitative. With your qualitative data points, those are more subjective, whereas your quantitative is really anything that can be objectively measured. So with qualitative, you have your testimonies, your quotes, your personal narratives, your impact statements. And quantitative, it's your itemized details of a product or service, number of participants engaged, number of events, map locations, anything that can be objectively measured. And when you're looking at those different types of data points, and I do recommend a diversity between the two, especially if you intend to try to make an argument about impact of what X initiative can do for whomever, then you want to also have your qualitative with your quantitative, because sometimes you start to get at those roots of what impact actually looks like, that tangible impact, rather than just the intention of what we say numbers mean, right? But when you're looking at that, start to think about what are the characteristics of these qualitative or quantitative data points that might speak the loudest. Sometimes between qualitative and quantitative data, you get data that speaks more to space, time, recursivity, scale, hierarchy. Some of the things that you might tend to highlight might be more so the intangible concepts or physical characteristics of something. You just have to learn what that target audience needs to be moved to action. Like, what are the type of things that motivate, incentivize, or inspire them? And so starting to look at data in categories and how you can evaluate them based on how well they might motivate or incentivize your target audience is really important to start developing that lens. So let's move on to call to action. When you're creating a call to action, you want to be specific. And when I say a call to action, I mean, are you asking this target audience to vote in a certain way, to enroll in a specific program, to donate money to something, to change, to accept your recommendations and change maybe their policies for how they do X? Thinking about that is really important because it's going to help you with your language and your ask, and it'll also show whether or not the media that you're creating is actually being used. You don't want people just to see your work. You want people to be influenced by it. So I like to point out the difference between advocacy and objective work in this scenario. So when it comes to what I tend to do in grassroots information design is I tend to be more advocacy focused rather than using more objective tones. Neither is right, neither is wrong. But the main reason is because with objective tones, sure, you're raising awareness, you're explaining and educating, you're more fact focused, but you tend to use more passive language. So sometimes you can lose meaning. Sometimes you make assumptions about what the audience may already know about that content, and you might not be able to help raise the awareness in a way that you intended. But when you are advocacy focused, not only are you using more direct and assertive language, but that call to action is the crux of how you begin to seek and form the voice and direction of your pieces, right? And you're focusing on emboldening or empowering people to do X, Y, or Z. Generally, this type of work is narrative-led, just to build in that fully embodiment and characteristics of the subject that you're speaking of. Neither is right or wrong. But that's generally the work that is asked for of me in the services that I provide. I also like to point out the difference between being asset and deficit focused with the infographics that you're creating. So if you're really trying to move people to action, you have to realize whether or not being asset focused or deficit focused is going to help them do that call to action. So when you're framed everything around assets, you're framing around resources, opportunities, potentials, and strengths. You're arguing positive effects when and if, put a pin in that. And deficit framing involves focusing on problems, obstacles, shortcomings, and weaknesses. You're condemning, you're criticizing, you're blaming. Neither is wrong or right, but if you're trying to get an institution to change its practices, you don't want to come out of the gate condemning them. You want to encourage them to do whatever your recommendations are. And so there are ways to reframe conversations through the way that you intend to draw connections between visuals and the language that you're using. So for example, I worked on a campaign around PrEP, which is a medication that a person can take that helps them prevent being transmitted HIV, and the focus group was for young African Americans, and we wanted to reshape and focus around assets in that narrative. And so to us, that meant talking about resiliency. So here's some images from that content. You can really get how we framed around the asset of resiliency as a motivating factor for folks that are engaging in this definitely stigma-fueled sort of content, talking about HIV, talking about AIDS, and of course you can't have those conversations without talking about homophobia, transphobia, all of those spaces, and sex and all of that. And so making sure that resilience was the conversation and not death, dying, or any other type of negative thing that would detract from our goal of motivating more young African Americans to participate in using PrEP. So we're going to move on to the principles. I have 15 minutes left, so I'm going to try to be concise. All right, so my principles that I utilize in every piece that I do are my 6 principles of conscious and responsible design. The first one is authentic representation. How many people have heard of Margaret Cho? I imagine a lot of folks, so feel free to put in the chat room if you've heard of Margaret Cho. Margaret Cho is a Korean-American comedian here in the United States. And she was on a show back in the early 2000s called All American Girl. The show was created by ABC, and it was putting some scenarios from some of her original stand-up into the public eye. So her talking about growing up Korean American, so forth and so on. But they had some issues with this program. So there was a specific incident that I think encapsulates it perfectly, where they asked Margaret Cho to come in to the studio just to do a quick little commercial break sort of promo for the holidays. And she was like, sure, of course, you're paying my checks, I'll come on in. And when she was sitting there in front of the camera, they said, okay, we would like you to say happy holidays from ABC. She goes, oh, that's so easy. They go, okay, ready, set, now say it in your native language. And she said, happy holidays from ABC. And the whole studio was furious with her response. They wanted her to speak Korean, but she didn't feel like that was an authentic representation of her. You asked her to speak in her native language. Well, she's an all-American girl. Like, that's how she felt she was best represented. And from ABC's perspective, they felt like that she was completely wrong. So they actually hired a coach that would help her be more Asian on the show. It's pretty inflammatory and pretty disgusting, but that's actually something that they did because they thought any representation is good representation versus looking at authentic representation. So that's my example of what I mean by authentic representation. The next principle is mindful and sensitive portraiture. So I worked on a project in GRID that was all around how incarceration affects families and children in Kentucky, because in Kentucky we do incarcerate at a high rate. We have a lot of prisons in our state. And so when I was doing this work, I worked with a very large review board of folks, some folks that were from nonprofits or organizations that advocated for families or children that were connected with or affected by incarceration. And I also worked with parents that were formerly incarcerated and adult children of parents that were either formerly or currently incarcerated. So the first thing that happened out of the gate was the organizations and institutions had data points that they really wanted me to use in this web infographic that they felt like they used a lot for funding that would help continue to validate their work. And one such data point had to do with the recursivity really it had to do with the likelihood of a child with a parent that was either formerly or currently incarcerated, the likelihood of that child themselves to be incarcerated in the future. And that data point, when I investigated the research study, I could see the credibility and merit and where it was coming from, so I included it in one of the drafts. But when I sent it out to that review body, the first response back I got were from parents. And they said, "How dare you? How dare you criminalize my child? Right now you're creating a narrative that sets them up to the world as future criminals, and they already have enough to deal with." So that became a mediated conversation between GRID, those organizations, that organization that really wanted me to use that data point, and those parents. And the end result was that I did not use that data point. This visual is not that data point. This is another part of that web infographic, because I wanted to make sure that I was mindful and sensitive to the portraiture of how the community most impacted wanted to be portrayed. We see this a lot with institutional language being problematic when placed in the public eye. Not all the language that we use clinically or that we use for advocating for need is actually how people may want to be displayed, in the public eye. So reviewing how language is used and how you're displaying people is really important, which is, again, why you need impacted people part of the work, because that's a huge blind spot that I see very often when I'm working with institutions and organizations. So the next principle is making sure that you narrate your data points. In that same infographic, I ran into an issue where there was a data point that talked about how much Kentucky spends on incarceration per year, which was a huge, huge amount. And I wanted to use that as an opportunity to talk about restorative justice as an option to punitive measures. But I didn't have much space to have that conversation, because there's actually a ratio of how long a web infographic can be before people stop reading. So what I was worried about, the mechanism, the psychological mechanism, was whether or not if I didn't have room to explain it well, would that mess with people's selective perception of it. And what I mean by selective perception, the best way I can describe it is by asking you, have you heard of All in the Family? Some of you may have heard of it. Feel free to type in the chat room if you have heard of All in the Family. If you haven't heard of All in the Family, have you heard of Family Guy? Because All in the Family is really just a precursor to that same model. It's pretty much the same show. So All in the Family was actually created by these two authors who are pretty big social justice advocates. I think one is still alive and still doing really, really good work. But their goal was to create a show that looked at someone that had someone depicted that was ignorant, sexist, all of the isms, homophobic, all these things, but this person was meant to be slovenly. You're not supposed to want to be this person. They're supposed to be dumb, they're supposed to be laughable. This is going to be a comedy that puts this type of person that no one should want to be in the place of being laughed at, right? So that's what this comedy was supposed to do. But when it was released, the interesting thing that happened was that about half of the audience that watched it got that it was satire and loved to laugh at Archie Bunker. But the problem was the other half of the audience saw this show and thought, this guy thinks exactly how I think. I love this show. And so you had this huge audience that loved All in the Family, but for two very, very, very different reasons. So that's what I mean by selective perception. If I wasn't going to have the space to really talk about restorative justice in a way that I thought people would get while I would bring up that data point about the cost, then there was no point in using it. So I actually ended up taking that data point out of that graphic as well. Another principle that I operate with around is disaggregation of data. And all that means is if you're going to say this percentage of Asians do this, then you have to be willing to contextualize all of the different Asian experiences within that data point and analyze whether or not those actually reflect those experiences of anyone who identifies within the Asian umbrella, because there are several countries in the continent of Asia, and their experiences as in America is recontextualized and very different. East Asians have a very different experience than anyone from Syria and the United States. That's just an example. The next thing that I think about a lot is recursive feedback cycles, which I've already talked about. Being in constant conversation with people that are impacted and working in those circles. Collaboration is key to making good work, and making sure that the work that you're doing is led by the population most affected. Again, to get those root causes, to build buy-in, get realistic solutions. There's so many good reasons. And bringing back to what Natasha said, she talks about how we as individuals also have a very rigid and limited perception of the world, and our ability to perceive is limited by that perception. So our ability to actually create a variety of solutions is pretty darn finite. So being collaborative is so essential to coming up with more inventive, accurate, tailored, and effective solutions. So how do you evaluate power dynamics as you're doing your work? I was going to talk about some common power dynamics that I see, but I'm kind of pressed for time, so I'm going to keep moving forward. But a mechanism that I use to evaluate power dynamics in my work is actually by this wonderful woman who's also in Louisville, Kentucky, called Monica Leslie. I call it the Monica Leslie method because it just works every time. And it's to look at your work through a tiered system. It's the work you're doing on Tier 1, where you're doing things on behalf of impacted groups, where you're locking them out of the process, decision-making, and project control. Is on Tier 2, where you have limited consultations with that group, like maybe you've identified in a proposal that you're going to meet with people 3 times, but there's so many areas that you're locking them out of having meaningful influence over. And is it on Tier 3, where there's shared decision-making between impacted groups and the group that's your team that you're working with? And also Tier 4 is the work that you're doing controlled by the people most impacted by the issue. I always recommend staying in those top tiers, Tier 3 and Tier 4. Anything else leaves you very vulnerable to blind spots, bias, and having solutions that have good intentions but very low-level impact. Moving forward, design phase. Okay, so I don't have much time, so I'm going to go through as much as I can. So design phase, when we start to spatially organize things and visually design. So when we're looking at potential media vehicles, you have to do more than just make a comprehensive report. I'm really sorry to say that, but it's so true. So many people ask me to make reports, and oftentimes people get those reports and they put it on their shelves because people already are suffering from content fatigue in various different professions, whether from policymaker to your cohorts and colleagues. So you have to do more than just making a report. So I always recommend doing some type of web infographic, some type of explainer that's a one-pager, social media post infographic, or some type of educational poster. And when you're being strategic about which ones to choose, you want to make sure that if you're doing social media posts, that your format is simplified, that maybe there's links in the content, that you have a central focus, because again, like social media has that same overuse of content. So you want to get your point across quickly with whatever information you're trying to prioritize to get to your target audience. If you're using educational or presentation material, if it's a teaching tool, thinking about the size, where it's displayed, and how it's displayed, all factors in to whether or not people are going to be receptive. And if you're doing something printed, if you're sharing these explainers for partners to utilize in their work, think about whether or not they're printing it from their own computers, or is it something that's being mailed? If they're printing it from their own computers, do you have to think about bleeds, anything that's going from edge to edge? Does printing quality matter? Or do you want it to be something that can be easily printed and then divided up into 4 so they can share it with even more folks as they are doing their organizing work or in and out of meetings or whatnot? Being aware of whether or not your web infographic works best with your target audience by being scrollable or just being one simple visual within a body of text. Again, whether or not that is interactive, there's motion involved, or linked content, and analyzing the platforms that you're posting on is so invaluable. We're thinking about layout. We have 3 minutes left, so I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to jump forward. There's so much content. Because my goal is always to help people break free from just using pie charts and bar graphs, which is why I created the infographic wheel to begin with, and why I've been working on some other iterations of that tool with some colleagues that also do experience design in different gamification ways. I've actually gotten over 50 potential layouts for folks to experiment with. But I wanted to talk about what happens when we go from more of the diagrammatic and chart layouts that when you see them are fine within a larger presentation with lots of explanation, but don't read quickly for target audiences that have limited time as a resource. Looking more at allegorical and analog sort of visualizations that help people at a glance start to infer meaning. Like, all those things are so essential, and even using a variety of different layouts. This is just an example of the backside of a one-page explainer, just to create variety and start to aggregate a lot of different data sets together in different visual ways. The visual strategies that I recommend the most is making sure that you're optimizing your assets. You're making sure that you're using space. It's not about filling the space, because the eye needs a rest, and space also creates focus. But making sure that you have a narrative flow to the way that you design, and you're working very hard to keep things simple. So I'm going to show you some more work and show you some examples of this. Is like a social media post that uses diagonal lines to push the eye around the page, but creates great focus using key points around the page. Even here, where you have more of the another thing that's kind of moving your eye around, like the subtle arrow versus the truncated, so you know where it begins and where it ends. We naturally read left to right, and so at a glance, without reading the content, you know intuitively how to move through the page. And I was going to give you some tips of how to go from text to graphic, but I wanted to make sure that Rachel had time to kind of jump back to some other things that she wanted to notify you about and be respectful of your time. So Rachel, if you wanted to jump in, I can just pause for right here, and yeah, we can catch up that way.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jessica, for sharing all the content. Reminder to everyone that I will share the link to Jessica's full PowerPoint slide deck so you can review all the information she shared with us. Also in that email, I will send a link to the post-event survey. Please, I would love your feedback to hear what you thought about today's webinar, and most importantly, to share suggestions for future topics for this Health for a Change training. I already thought of one, like part 2 with Jessica Bellamy would be awesome for me. No one could see me, but I was nodding my head because there are so many great things for me to think about, like everyone is creative, resourceful, and whole. So thank you, Jessica, so much for being on our webinar today. All the information is on the Foundation's website, healthy-ky.org, also on our social media. And I welcome your direct emails. If I can be of help with something, please call me. Jessica, honored to have you on the webinar today. Thank you for being here. I look forward to continuing August 2nd, who are joining our workshop. There's only a few spots available, so if you aren't registered for Jessica's workshop here at the Foundation offices, do that today. That's your call to action. Thanks everyone for joining us today. A lot to think about, a lot I can put in practice at my work, and I hope yours as well. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much for your time.
And that does conclude today's webinar. Again, thank you for your participation.